Okay, 12:30. So, does anybody in here know a student named Mark Summers? Is Mark Summers here? So I got an email from Mark Summers last night, and I assumed he was a student in this class, although I can't find him on the roster. But he sent me a great email that I wanted to share with everyone. It is. I'm not being sarcastic. It's a great email. And he sent me a quote, I guess, from a news story that I thought was very appropriate. The story starts with the name of a 14-year-old student. I guess her name is, we'll just call her Christy because I can't pronounce her actual name. And the story is, Christy, a 14-year-old from Truckee, California, has taken 3 days off from school so she could camp out near the theater in Westwood Village, neighborhood of LA. She and her mother, Laurie, are two of the estimated 500 people who started arriving on Thursday with pup tents, lawn chairs, and sleeping bags in the hope of securing a good spot on or near the red carpet. Mother Laurie said she thinks, quote, half of the teachers would be very excited if she knew what Christy was doing, end quote. And then the person who sent me the email, Mark Summers, wrote, perhaps a timely illustration of the false consensus effect. And I agree. I'm guessing half of Christy's teachers would not be impressed. Anyway, if you know Mark, tell him I said thank you. I can't find him anywhere on my computer from ever having taken this class. No, I looked in my previous grade lists and things like that. Can't find him. So I emailed him back and said, who are you? And nice email, but I also said, who are you? So if I find out, I'll let you know. It's who? You're him? All right. Thank you. Why aren't you on my roster? Oh, that's not your real name. All right. I'm getting sent emails under assumed names. Well, it was still a cool email, whoever you are. I'm going to call you Batman, if that's okay. All right. Good email. All right, so when we left off last time, we were talking about cognitive dissonance. And we're going to continue talking about cognitive dissonance, but we were talking about this first very classic study in cognitive dissonance by Leon Festinger back in the 50s. And just to sort of refresh the details of this, because I want to make sure that people are clear on what happened and why it happened in this study, because it's a really important study in the history of social psychology. All subjects came in, they all did an incredibly boring task, okay? And then everyone was asked essentially to go lie to the next subject and tell them what a cool study this was. Okay? Half of the subjects were told, we're going to pay you a lot of money to go get the next subject ready, but the implication is to lie. And the other subjects were told, we're going to pay you a very small amount of money to go get the next subject ready, or in essence, to lie. Okay? After going and lying to the next subject, okay, all these folks who had done the incredibly boring task and now lied and told someone else it was an interesting task, were asked, oh, before you leave, I have one more thing I was supposed to ask you to fill out. Okay? And on this last thing that they're asked to fill out, they indicate how much they themselves really enjoyed doing the incredibly boring task. Okay? And what they found, okay, is that those who had been paid $1 to do the incredibly boring task now say that they like the task quite a bit. Those paid $20 to do those paid $1 to lie now say they really did like the task they did previously. Those paid $20 to lie Okay? Now say, no, didn't like the task at all. Okay? And so the implication of this study is that the reason why these folks are saying, I liked that boring task, is because they experience dissonance about lying to the next person. And one way to resolve that dissonance about lying is to make what would be a lie into not a lie. If I can convince myself that I actually enjoyed the task, then going and telling the next person I enjoyed the task isn't a lie. Okay? In contrast, and I'll come back to you in a second, in contrast, the person who got paid $20 can tell themselves a different story. They can say, look, I lied, but I know why I lied. I lied for a lot of money, and I'm okay with that. Yes, lies are bad, but not all lies are created equally. This lie isn't that harmful, and I got paid a boatload of money. Okay, I'm going to go rent a limo now. Okay? So these folks have sufficient justification for what they did. These folks do not have sufficient justification for what they did. Now, why did these folks actually agree to go tell the next person that the experiment was fun? Why did they agree to that in the first place? Okay? These subjects believe that they freely chose to go and do this. Okay? But we know by this point in social psychology that the real reason people are willing to do something that they don't really like the idea of doing for a very small amount of money is because of obedience to authority. Okay? So the real reason everyone says, yeah, I'll go lie to the next person is because obedience to authority is at work. But situational pressures are often invisible. Okay? And so as a result, when this person thinks about why did I go lie to that next person, they can't say to themselves, or they don't say to themselves, I know why I lied to that next person because there was an authority figure, and I tend to do what authority figures ask me to do. That's the real reason. That's actually a sufficient justification, but they're not aware of it because these things happen outside of awareness. So instead, they have to say, well, I guess I freely chose to do it. Why would I have freely chosen to have done that? That makes me uncomfortable. I'm going to change my belief about this, and by doing so, I eliminate the sense that I've lied. Okay, is there still a question in the front? Okay. So are there questions on this result, why this result came about? Makes sense. Okay, good. Now there are sort of 4 classic varieties of dissonance studies. That was the first kind. That's called the insufficient justification paradigm. Okay. I will not ask you on the exam which of these is an insufficient justification paradigm. I'm using these terms so that we have a way to refer to them. But I would never ask you, this would never be a choice. Insufficient justification paradigm, free choice paradigm. I just might use that to help introduce a question, and then I would describe the method itself. In the second of these, that is typically referred to as the free choice paradigm, this was done by Jack Brem, who was a student of Festinger's. Okay? And in this study, and hundreds of studies like it in the years since, subjects are asked to sort of rank some initial set of things. In this study, he brought in sort of stay-at-home moms, which of course in 1955, pretty much all moms were stay-at-home moms. He brought them in and he told them it was a marketing study about appliances. So we were looking at sort of how effectively various appliances kind of marketed themselves, sold themselves to people. Okay? So he showed them these 8 appliances, like a toaster and I don't know what else. They didn't have microwaves yet, but other things you could put in front of a person. 8 of them. Okay? And then each subject was asked to rank them from most liked to least liked. So what's your number 1 ranked appliance, number 2, so on down to number 8. So they do this ranking. And after doing this, the subjects are then told, by the way, as part of your payment for today, okay, we're going to let you take one of these appliances home with you. Okay, you're going to get one of these appliances as a gift. Now, it just so happens that we have 2 appliances that we have extras of, and you can choose which of those 2 you would like to take home. Okay, now this was a lie. They have all 8. But what they do is they always give the subjects what's essentially a hard choice. Okay? They give them a choice between the one they ranked number 4 and the one they ranked number 5. Okay? So these are two right in the middle of their rankings, and they're pretty similar to each other. So there's probably some things that they like about each, some things that they don't like about each. Okay? On average, subjects tend to choose the one they had ranked 4th, but not always. Sometimes people say, well, now that I think about it a little more, I'd rather have the 5th. Okay? So half of the subjects get to choose between the 4th and 5th ranked item, which ones they would like to take home with them at the end of the experiment. But the other half of the subjects are told, as part of your participation today, you are going to get one of these appliances to take home, and here it is. And they're just shown the one that they had ranked number 4, and that's it. So you have some subjects who are freely choosing between the items they ranked 4th and 5th, and other people who are just given the item that they probably would have chosen if given a choice. But here there's no choice. They're just given the item. Okay? And then a few minutes later, before they leave, the experimenter says, oh, by the way, we just want you to rank these one more time for us based on just however you're feeling right now. So just rank them 1 to 8 based on however you're feeling now. So they rank the 8 appliances again. And what the experimenter is interested in is how their rankings change from the first ranking to the second ranking as a function of whether or not they were choosing an item to take home or simply given an item to take home. Now, in the absence of something like cognitive dissonance theory, you'd say, who cares? What's the difference? It doesn't really matter. Right? Why should there be anything moving around? But from the perspective of cognitive dissonance theory, we can say, oh, this, choosing between number 4 and number 5, which are pretty evenly matched, that creates conflict for a person. Because on the one hand, if they accept this 4th ranked item, they're rejecting something else they liked almost as much. So that's kind of a dissonant thing to do. But also in accepting the 4th ranked item, they're accepting an item that probably has flaws that are almost just as great as whatever flaws were in number 5. So there's kind of a conflict between accepting something you don't love and rejecting something you don't hate. Okay, it's a hard choice. Their theory is that if you were choosing between the one you ranked number 1 and number 8, there would be no effects on your rankings initially and your subsequent rankings. But if there's a conflict-laden choice, like here, there should be attitude change. But again, not if you were simply given item number 4. Okay, because there's no dissonant cognitions here. So the dissonant cognitions, just so that you have a sense of what they might be in this case, I spelled them out for you. The selected item is chosen freely, and it has some weaknesses, things you might not want. And the rejected item has some strengths that you would have liked to have gotten. So there's this conflict there. And what they find, okay, it's actually a little hard to see these. Somehow the color didn't come out so well. But what you see is, what's on here is the change in liking from the first ranking to the last ranking, or the change in the rankings going up or down. So what we see is the item they selected when they got to choose went up about 1.5 ranks in the re-ranking. So it went from 4 to somewhere between 2 and 3 in the re-rankings. And the one they rejected went from 5 down to somewhere between 6th and 7th. Okay, so what they've essentially done is they've taken the two items that were hard for them to choose between, and they've spread the difference between them in their revised rankings of those items. Okay? So now, psychologically, they're treating these items as much more different from each other than they did in the initial rankings. Okay? In contrast, when there was no choice, when they were simply given the 4th ranked item, there's no changes. There's no changes in their re-rankings. So it's not like 4th ranked items always go up and 5th ranked items always go down. It only seems to happen to these items where there was a conflict over what to choose. And the idea, okay, is that by separating these two in one's re-rankings, okay, we've now made the choice much less dissonant. Now there's a clear choice, because if you had initially given me the item ranked second and asked me to compare that to the item ranked 6th or 7th, I'd say that's a no-brainer. That's easy. There's no dilemma there. And so what they've done is they've revised their impressions to create a conflict-free choice in retrospect. Okay? So remember, one of the hypotheses, hypothesis 5, has as one of the two parts that we're motivated to be consistent. Okay? And it's easier to feel consistent about the choice you've made when you've made an easy choice between the 2nd rank and 6th ranked items. But in order to do that, what our brain does is goes and switches our memory for what we thought all along. So internally, this makes us feel consistent. Externally, this makes us look like we're rationalizing and changing how we feel about things after the fact to make it fit with the events as they happened. Okay, was there a question? I answered it. Perfect. I was hoping I would. Yeah. Do people realize that they're doing this? It's a good question. Okay. We're going to come back to that towards the end of this lecture. That was actually the first major thing I studied. That's actually why I have a job here at UCLA, because I asked that question. And so we'll come back to that at the end. So yeah, that's a great example of the reasonable person standard, me saying that's a great question to her when it was the question that I asked 15 years ago. So yeah, of course I think that's a great question. But I do. I think it's a good question. All right. So the third of these types of cognitive dissonance studies might be characterized either as the hazing or initiation rites studies, or they're often referred to as the effort equals liking studies. And what that means will become clear to you in a moment. So this was done by Elliot Aronson back in, I think, the late 50s. Okay? If you ever see the book The Social Animal, it's one of the most famous books in the history of social psychology. He wrote this book, I guess, sometime in the late 60s, and it's in its 12th edition or something. This is the study that probably got him the most attention. And in this study, he had women showing up because they had been invited to join a women's discussion group. And I have no idea what the discussion group was supposed to be about. Not important. The key thing is that he set them up, okay, and told them that in order to actually get into this group, you have to pass a test. Okay? And in one group, there was just some simple control task. Okay, maybe it was just reading a paragraph out of a GRE type of paragraph, something boring, innocuous. Okay, just read that out loud. And the idea was, we want to make sure that people are sort of good readers and can speak clearly. That's what they were told was the purpose of this test. If you're going to be in this discussion group, we want to make sure you can do that. There was another group that was given a mild initiation, where they were given a paragraph to read, and it had some mild taboo language, sort of the kinds of things that you can barely get on TV, but you can get them on sort of ABC, NBC, CBS TV, whatever that was back in 1958. I don't know what that was, like maybe using the word mom instead of mother was slightly taboo language, I'm not sure. But the key thing is that was then in comparison to a severe initiation in which they were asked to read a paragraph that contained, for the time, very taboo language. Okay? So they are in one of these three conditions, and then they're all told, okay, great, you're in the group now. And then you go in and have a discussion with this discussion group. And after you're done with the discussion, you come back out, and you're asked to fill out a number of different things. And one of the questions people were asked is, how much did you enjoy that conversation you had in the discussion group? So they rate how much they enjoyed it. And the reason dissonance is relevant here is because, on the one hand, women in 1958 were likely to think, I'm a traditional person who speaks appropriately in public, because they were reading these out loud in public in front of other people they didn't know. But on the other hand, they think to themselves, I freely engaged in inappropriate public speech. Now, we as social psychologists know they didn't freely engage. We as social psychologists know the reason that people in the severe initiation condition read this paragraph was because of obedience to authority. Okay? But they don't know that because situations are invisible. Okay? So when they think about what they've done, this is how they have to probably construe the behavior they've engaged in. They believe that I chose to do that. And at some level they did, but it's probably not accurate to say they freely and sort of in an uninhibited way chose to do that. Okay? So there's sort of dissonance there between those two cognitions, and that dissonance leads to those in the severe initiation group saying they really like the conversation, significantly more than the folks in the control and mild initiation groups. Okay? So they had to work harder. They had to violate some norm of their own in order to get into this group. And as a result of that, they then said, I really liked that group. I really liked that conversation. And the reason this reduces dissonance is because by saying this is the best group ever, I can't believe I got into such an awesome group, it creates a sufficient justification. Okay? They can say, wow, I don't like speaking in a taboo way in public. And that's not really my thing. But if I'm going to get into the best group ever, I'm willing to do something extra. Okay? But the way that this happens is, it's not that they ahead of time knew that this was the best group ever and they would work harder to get into it. Instead, they retrospectively are changing their understanding of the group to justify the inappropriate behavior that they engaged in. They're rationalizing. At least that's what it looks like from the outside when you compare these three folks. And so this is why these are sometimes referred to as the effort equals liking study. If I have to work harder to get into a group or to get anything, to get a book, to get into a class, whatever it is, if I have to work harder, part of the way my mind justifies that additional effort that I put in is by essentially coding that thing that I then did as better. The more effort I apply to get into a group or to get something, the more dissonance is going to lead me to think, wow, that was a really good thing to get into.
How long does that effect last? Like if they had further discussions, would it still be there?
That's a good question on a multiple levels. We don't know how long an effect like this lasts because social psychologists almost never care about what happens 5 minutes after the study's done. Okay? This is one of the big, real profound, I think, flaws in almost every study that I'm going to tell you about this quarter is that we don't know if this would hold up, 10 conversations later with the same group. My guess is it would, but not necessarily because of dissonance, but because once you initially encode the group as being the best group ever, that sets in motion a series of other sort of self-fulfilling prophecies. You engage the group in a different way, and if you're more motivated, that might actually make the group a better group, and all these things that might follow. But there's a lot of effects that we look at where we establish that something happens because we're interested in what are the basic psychological mechanisms, but there's sort of more applied questions about how much do these things affect long-term consequences in the real world, and social psychologists almost never look at those things. Okay, the last of the dissonance types of studies, the big obvious implication, and the reason I always talk about this one in this class, is because this study is a beautiful illustration of why fraternities and sororities have hazing, right? It really explains why, yes, it's fun to haze people. There's no question about that, whether it's, official hazing in the context of, fraternities, sororities, whatever, or just someone that you're sort of giving a little bit of a hard time. That can be fun in itself, so I don't want to discount that part. But it also serves a really important function. If you have to work harder to make it in the Marines, if you have to work harder to get accepted into a fraternity, that's going to lead you to be far more bonded to that organization because our brain justifies the things that we work hard to do. And that's probably the best evidence, actually, that this does have long-term effects because we know that people do end up super, super bonded to those kinds of organizations when there's a really high bar to getting into those. It's messy because obviously those folks were really motivated to get into the fraternity, but having them have to work even harder to get in, I think helps promote that. And that's one of the things I think this study probably demonstrates. All right, the last of these kinds of studies are called the counter-attitudinal essay studies. And these were done by Darrell Bem. So remember, we talked about Darrell Bem before when we were discussing the philosophers and in particular Kant. Darrell Bem was the psychologist, is the psychologist, who came up with the idea of self-perception theory, that sometimes we know ourselves by looking at our own behavior. Okay. Here, he's focusing on dissonance, and he does something a little bit like the free choice studies with the ranked 8 items. Okay? So there's a parallel here, but it's different. Okay? But he measures attitudes towards some topic at the beginning and at the end of a study. Okay? And so in this study, let's imagine that people are asked, they go to UCLA, they go to this classroom, and they say, how do you feel about the idea of raising tuition for next year? Okay, on a scale from 1 to 20, how much of a good idea do you think it is to raise tuition next year? And of course, undergraduates typically say, not a good idea, right? So they say, nope, don't like that. My attitude is negative towards that idea of raising tuition. And then, okay, he asks them to do something. Just like in the free choice study, they're asked to sort of freely choose to do something that's going to create dissonance. In this case, the subjects are asked to write a counter-attitudinal essay on topic X. So here, they're asked to write an essay on why raising tuition next year would be a good thing. Okay? Some people are told, some people, the experimenter says this to some of the subjects. They say, okay, we're having some people write pro-tuition essays where it's about increasing tuition, and we're having some people take the sort of anti-position where they're writing on why you shouldn't raise tuition. You've been assigned to the pro-tuition raising position. So you are required to spend the next 10 minutes writing an essay on why raising tuition next year would be a good thing. These folks do not feel like they have any choice. They feel like I'm in an experiment and I have to do this, but they know that they've been coerced to do it. On the other hand, there's another condition where sort of sly social psychology comes in. And here, the experimenter says, all right, we're having people write essays about these two positions, okay? And you can choose yourself which essay you want to write. But here's the thing. We already have more essays than we need for the anti-position. See, we need 50 and 50 essays, and right now we have 50 people who have already written essays saying why raising tuition is a bad thing, and we really need some more essays on why raising tuition would be a good thing. So, if you wanted to, that would be really great. It would really help us out. Okay, but it's your choice. Your choice. Okay? And most of the people, but not all, but most of the people in this condition choose to write the pro essay, and they feel that they've freely chosen to do it. Okay? Now, they throw out the data from anyone who writes the anti-essay because they're only interested in what happens if you write the pro essay, either when you feel forced to do it or you feel that you've freely chosen to do it. It's your own free will. After doing this, at some point after doing it, they measure your attitude again. Okay? And what they're interested in is, do you become more in favor of topic X, in this case raising tuition, okay, as a function of having freely chosen to do something that's inconsistent with your own attitudes on that topic. And so here the dissonant cognitions are A, I'm against X, I'm against raising tuition, but in this condition, I feel that I freely chose to write an essay in favor of raising tuition. So these two cognitions are in conflict with one another. Okay? So the basic finding from this that has been shown again and again and again and again with lots of different attitude topics is this. So some people write no essay, and from before to after, they show no attitude change. So you can't really see it, but there's a little basically flat line yellow bar here, so that if they wrote no essay at all, and you measure their attitudes at 2 different times, their attitude stays the same. I was against it when we started, I'm against it now. If they feel coerced, they show a little bit of an increased attitude change from the first attitude rating to the second, but not much, and this isn't significantly different than 0. But if subjects feel that they freely chose to write this essay in favor of raising tuition, they now have a significantly more positive attitude towards raising tuition next year. Okay? Significantly more positive. Now, I don't remember what scale this is on. This might be on a 1 to 30 scale, in which case their attitudes might still be relatively negative. So that's not the sort of end point of their attitude is less important. What's more important for the purpose of understanding this dissonance process is that their attitudes reliably change in the direction of an essay that they freely chose to write, and it's an essay that they wrote that's in contrast to their sort of previously stated attitudes, their basic attitudes, because there's dissonance there. Now, there's been many, many studies using this paradigm, but Bam and McConnell did something special in this study that makes it my favorite study of this type that's been done. The first thing to know is that while they had people give their initial attitudes and write the essay on one day, they didn't measure their final attitudes until a week later. A week later, they had the same subjects come back into the lab, and the first thing they asked them is, what's your attitude towards raising tuition? Okay, and that's where these results come from. So this is from a week ago to now. And I wrote an essay a week ago, and now my attitude has changed. So I guess this one answers your question as well. They looked at a week apart. Usually, they do this all in one testing session in the course of an hour. But in this particular study, there was a week delay between when they wrote the essay and when they gave their final attitudes. The reason why this is really interesting is because they then asked subjects, okay, for this next one, don't tell us what your attitude is towards raising tuition now. What I want you to do is remember what you told us your attitude was a week ago, before you wrote that essay. Okay? Remember you came in a week ago, you wrote that essay. Okay, we're not going to talk about the essay, but you wrote that essay. And before that, we asked you, what is your attitude towards raising tuition? Tell us, what was your attitude then? And so what I'm going to show you here is what's referred to as the attitude recall error. This is the discrepancy between their initial attitude and what they now say was their initial attitude. Okay. So let me walk you through this so you're really clear on what we're seeing here. Okay. In each case, people are essentially saying the attitude that they now have after having written the essay is the same attitude they had a week ago before they wrote the essay. Okay? So these folks who don't change their attitude are pretty good at saying what their old attitude was because they still have the same attitude, and they're saying, yeah, I have that same attitude. It hasn't changed. I said 5 a week ago. I think it's a 5 now. My attitude hasn't changed, so I'm going to say 5 again, and they're pretty much right. Now here, in the big error condition, these folks are saying, okay, in reality, let's say they said 5 on a 30-point scale a week ago. So all these folks a week ago said 5. So these folks actually said 5, but now they've changed their attitude by 10 points. Right? This is how much they've changed. So now their attitude's a 15. So they were 5 a week ago, now they're a 15, and when you say, what were you a week ago, they say, I was a 15. Okay? They're saying they've always had the same attitude. It hasn't changed. Okay? So they're changing their attitudes by 10 points, and now they're mistaken about what their old attitude was by 10 points. Because they think they've had the same attitude all along, and so they're using their current attitude to figure out what their old attitude was. Okay? They're not introspectively pulling out the truth of what their attitude was a week ago. They're doing something that's inferential. They're saying, well, if I'm a 15 now, I was probably a 15 a week ago. So each of these groups is as exactly mistaken as how much they've changed their attitudes because of the dissonance process. Okay? So sort of going back to the question that was asked here, this really starts to raise the question of, are subjects aware that they're changing their attitudes as a result of the dissonance process? Are they aware of that? Okay, we're going to come back to that, but this was one of the studies when I was in graduate school that I read that made me think, geez, maybe people aren't aware, because if they knew their attitude had changed, they would be more accurate here when they were asked about their old attitude. Okay? So the general finding here is that people are changing their attitude to be more consistent with their essay writing behavior. That's a basic dissonance effect. They don't seem to realize they've changed their attitudes, and as a function, they misremember the original attitude to be consistent with the current attitude. Okay? So again, there's this sense of, I've been consistent all along. Nothing's changed about me. I believe what I've always believed. But from the outside, we know that they've changed. But from the inside, it's not clear that they know they've changed. Okay? So one of the things this tells us, potentially, is that our attitudes aren't stored with sort of tags or ways of remembering them that remind us when we form those attitudes and how they've changed over time. Okay? We misremember lots of things in terms of how we used to be compared to now, and when we misremember them, we typically misremember them in ways that serve our current motivational goals. Okay? So in the dissonance study, people are misremembering their old attitude as being consistent with their current attitude, which makes them feel consistent. But there's other times where we actually exaggerate the difference between what we remember sort of being originally where we are now. So let me give you an example. There was a study done, and most of these studies were done by Michael Ross. He's the guy who's not the brother of Lee Ross that we mentioned, I think, in the last class. And he does all this work on autobiographical errors. And so he does these studies where he'll get someone's SAT scores. So let's say you take the SATs or the GREs and you don't do as well as you wanted to, and now you're going to go to the Princeton Review class. So you go spend months doing the Princeton Review class, it's grueling, and then you take the SATs or GREs or whatever it is again. And what he asks people is, okay, so what'd you get on your final SATs? And also, what do you remember having gotten on your initial SATs? And what he finds is that people who have gone through things like the Princeton Review say that their initial SAT scores were lower than they really were. They misremember them as being worse because then it makes them feel like the benefit they got from Princeton Review was better. By misremembering my initial scores being worse, I feel like I've improved more. And people do things like this all the time. When it's a domain where we want to feel that we've improved, we misremember our earlier mark as having been worse than it is. Whether it's SATs or weight when you're trying to go on a diet, people misremember their weight as having been higher than it really was when they've been on a diet, so that they can now say, I've lost more weight. Okay, so this is a common phenomenon. And part of this is that we don't have real good memory for these things in the first place. These things aren't typically things that we track really closely, and attitudes are really strong candidates for this kind of slipperiness, this ambiguity in terms of when they formed. So, most people, if you ask them when they're 40, what's your political orientation? How strongly are you liberal, conservative, Democrat, Republican? Most people can tell you. And then you ask them, so what were you 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so on? And what most people do is they'll say, well, I was roughly what I am now, right? I don't think I've changed. But it turns out there's lots of people who change between their 20s and 40s. A surprising amount do change, but those folks tend to overestimate the extent to which they've always held the same attitude. Because our memory doesn't seem to tag when we get an attitude. We only seem to keep track of our current attitude, and then we apply a theory to figure out, well, what was my old attitude? Probably the same as what it is now. Unless, of course, you have some major conversion event, right? So you were like a serious Democrat, and then something happens that makes you lose faith, and you become a serious Republican. Now, you're likely to overestimate how liberal you used to be, okay? Because you have this theory of, I had a big switch, and that is consistent with a really big change in attitudes, and so you overestimate. Okay. Now, let's go back to dissonance. How does dissonance reduction, or the attitude change that we ultimately see happening, how does it happen? Okay, at a very simple level, we know the events are supposed to occur as follows. You have some initial attitude or belief. I think raising tuition is a bad idea. You then have some counter-attitudinal event. You write an essay about why raising tuition's a good idea. Okay. This creates some kind of experience of dissonance, that yucky feeling in your gut that makes you uncomfortable. And somehow, in this magic box, when dissonance occurs, this leads to something like a revised attitude in most cases. Now I find myself thinking, I can see why raising tuition wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. It provides more services. It allows blah, 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 blah. Now, what we want to do is understand what's going on in this magic red box here. And Festinger and others who followed him said it was something like this. Okay? You've got the conflict between your counter-attitudinal event and your initial attitude. I wrote the counter-attitudinal essay, but I had the other attitude initially. And having this conflict literally causes physiological arousal. It turns on your autonomic nervous system. Okay? When we're distressed, when we are stressed, when we are threatened, this turns on the autonomic nervous system, makes us feel uncomfortable. Okay? So we have physiological arousal, which is then thought to lead to a conscious awareness of that discomfort. Okay, so we become aware that we're sort of sweating and physiologically aroused, which is kind of an aversive experience to have. Okay. And there is data to support that. If you give someone a shot of adrenaline and don't tell them that they're getting it, it makes them uncomfortable. It does. And then, this is a key thing, once you become aware that you're physiologically, uncomfortable, you've got to make an attribution for why you're feeling this discomfort, and you need to attribute that back to this conflict. So you've got this cognitive conflict that causes arousal, you become aware of that negative feeling, and then you say, well, why am I feeling this way? I know why I'm feeling this way. It's because I just did something that conflicts with my general beliefs. And then you engage in a process of changing your attitude in order to make everything consistent again. If I change my attitude, now I feel more consistent about the counter-attitudinal behavior I engaged in. Yeah? No, that's a good thought, right? So maybe it's just an introspective error. So now let me ask you, though. Do you think if I asked you to write an essay on why raising intuition's a good thing, do you think that, even though you might try to list some things, would get you to change your true beliefs about it? Right? A little bit, maybe. But I think for a lot of these things, most people from the outside, and this has been done, when they're asked, imagine you went through this study, how much would your attitudes change? Most people say, not at all. I know what I believe. I can write an essay, but I'm faking it. It's acting. It's not real. So most people say this would not change my attitudes. Also, if it was just an introspective error, people might be more able to remember that they used to have a different attitude. They might say, yeah, I've come to see the light a little bit, but I remember that I used to not be able to see the light. Okay? And they don't seem to be doing that either. These folks don't seem to recognize that their attitude has changed. Yeah? Does the attitude change what? I can't hear the very end. Go either way. So the attitude change in these studies always goes in the direction of the sort of counter-attitudinal behavior that you engaged in. So that's the way it goes. Now, if you had someone that was really, really in favor of raising tuition, and you had them write an anti-raising tuition essay, you could get the attitude to go in the other direction. But it's always going to be shifting away from their initial attitude towards the counter-attitudinal behavior that they engaged in. Okay. So this is kind of the official model of what happens during dissonance. And so I want to show you a couple studies that relate to this model. The first of these has to do with this clever insight that Mark Zanna and his advisor Joel Cooper had in the 70s, where they said, okay, if this is true, What if you mistakenly attribute the physiological arousal to something other than this discrepancy? See, this model says when you feel the negative arousal, you've got to think, I know where that's coming from. It's coming from the fact that I just did something that goes against my own beliefs and values. And that makes me uncomfortable. That's why I'm feeling this way. But what if you were tricked into thinking that something else caused that physiological arousal? Would that prevent you from changing your attitudes? So they did a clever study involving placebos, placebo pills. So what is a placebo pill? A placebo pill is typically a pill that's nothing but a little sugar pill that a doctor or someone else tells you has some particular effect on you. So if I give you a pill and say, this pill is going to make it so that you don't feel pain from your headache, and you take it and you believe that it's it's an Advil, but it isn't really, to the extent that you have less of a headache because of that pill, that's a placebo effect. There was no active pharmacological agent in the pill, yet we reliably see symptom reductions associated with what the doctor tells you the pill's going to do. So that's just background on what placebo pills do. In this particular study, people, before they went through the, I think, counterattitudinal essay type of study, they were either given no pill, so they went through the same study, that I just described to you, pretty much, or they were given a pill called an arousal pill. Okay? And they were told, this pill will make you feel physiologically aroused. Okay? So you can think of this as the Red Bull pill. Okay? This is the Red Bull pill. Okay? So 1/3 of people get no pill. 1/3 of people get a pill that they're told will make them physiologically aroused, but it's a placebo. This pill is exactly the same as this pill. Or, this pill is exactly the same as getting nothing. There's nothing in that pill that actually makes people aroused. And then in a third condition, they were told they were given a pill that was called relaxatin. Okay? And the idea is, this pill will make you feel relaxed. Okay? Yeah, it's a chill pill. So one pill is going to make you aroused, one pill will make you relaxed, and the other group has no pill. In all cases, nobody's actually taking a pill that changes their arousal level. But what's changing is their belief about what they're ingesting, what state they're likely to be in a few minutes. They then go through the counterattitudinal essay writing paradigm. And let's see what happens here. So if you get no pill, you get the same effects as in the BEM study I just showed you. People who freely chose to write the counterattitudinal essay show significantly more attitude change than folks who knew they were coerced. Okay, so this is the standard counterattitudinal essay effect. Okay. But then we have the folks who took the relaxatin. So these folks believe that they're going to be in a very relaxed state, low arousal. They go through the dissonance paradigm, and now they find themselves in a high arousal state because dissonance causes arousal. When you have conflicting cognitions, that causes an aroused state. Okay? And to these folks, in some ways feels even more aroused. Why? Because they're essentially doing a comparison. They're saying, how aroused am I right now compared to how aroused I should be? See, these folks are saying, I'm pretty aroused, and that's compared to a neutral baseline. These folks are saying, I'm pretty aroused, but I should be below my normal baseline right now because they gave me a pill to calm me down. So these folks feel even more aroused than they would, or they think they're more aroused than they should be relative to these folks. And as a result, they show even more attitude change. Okay? These folks feel like they have an even bigger physiological conflict going on with them, and so they're more motivated to change their attitude to a greater degree. Okay? Now the last condition. These are the folks who got the arousal pill. Okay? The folks who got the arousal pill are told, you're going to feel aroused in 20 minutes. So, when they go through the dissonance paradigm, and they have the conflict, where I've freely chosen to write an essay that conflicts with my basic attitudes and beliefs about raising tuition, when they get to the point where they recognize that they're aroused, they have an explanation for that arousal that doesn't have anything to do with dissonance. They say, oh, I just took a pill that made me aroused. And because they can attribute their arousal to the pill rather than to the discrepancy, they show no attitude change. Okay? So these folks who have another explanation for their high level of current arousal, the pill they believed was going to cause them to be aroused, these folks do not show the same attitude change that everybody else does. Okay? Yeah?
So for the relaxing, it was the counterintuitive concept that triggered it, which caused all the...
So in both of these groups, the no pill and the relaxating group, they believe the reason they're feeling aroused right now is because they did something dissonant. They wrote a counterattitudinal essay. But these folks think, not only am I aroused right now, but I'm way more aroused than I should be because I should be below baseline in terms of arousal. So for them, it's kind of like they think the conflict is even bigger, which warrants an even bigger attitude change in order to kind of cope with the negative physiological state. Okay? Any other questions on this study? I know it's sometimes a complex study to understand because there's kind of placebo stuff and other stuff mixed in here. Okay. So, this is a description that I've just gone over a couple times. If given a pill that you believe will relax you, then dissonance-induced arousal is surprising and is experienced as more intense, leading to greater dissonance reduction. And then this one explains the arousal pill condition. So, okay, now I want to come back sort of formally to this question. Is cognitive dissonance always a conscious process? Okay. When we rationalize, do we know that we're doing it? When we change our attitudes in these ways, do we recognize that our attitudes are changing? Okay. I think we already have a hint from the Darrell Bem study that we don't, at least sometimes. And if we don't, this might contribute to us not knowing ourselves as well as we think, because we think our attitudes are more constant than they are, or at least some of our attitudes are more constant than they are. Okay? And it also might contribute to our misunderstanding of others, because we see them from the outside rationalizing, and we think to ourselves, man, what's wrong with you that you can't just acknowledge what we both knew was true last week? I'm sorry that girl wouldn't go out with you, but we both know a week ago you were crazy about her, and you can't say now that you weren't that into her ever, because we both know you were. Well, maybe the person who changed their attitude doesn't know that they used to feel differently. Maybe some of the time these things change, and as they change, it's a little bit like that clip from Dark City, where something changes in your mind, and you have no memory that things were ever different. And so you go on thinking this is what I always believed, and it's not an inauthentic process, at least from the inside. Okay. On the other hand, Festinger and others said various things about dissonance that make us think that they really believe this was a conscious process. So Festinger wrote, dissonance reduction does indeed require that time be spent in thinking about the characteristics of the alternative. And there's various other quotes from folks then and more recently talking about sort of the conscious way we think about what happened to us, why we're feeling aroused, okay, and going through the process of effortfully changing our attitudes. So let's look at where conscious processes might be at work. Remember, these are three of the steps that are involved in the mechanism of dissonance reduction as described by Festinger. So you get the discomfort physiologically, you become aware of the discomfort, you attribute that discomfort to the conflict, and then you change your attitude. And so awareness of the discomfort naturally involves awareness. That's a conscious process. Attributing the conflict that you're feeling, the distress that you're feeling, to the counterattitudinal behavior, okay, should involve explicit conscious memory for the fact that you just wrote a counterattitudinal essay. Okay? And then if the attitude change itself is an effortful process, that should involve thinking, reflective, conscious processes. So, the sort of first study that I did that actually got any attention long ago had to do with this issue of explicit conscious memory and what happens to this process if you can't remember Now that should say discrepant, but instead it says discrepanct, which is not a word as far as I know. But I wrote it, so there it is. So what if you can't remember that you just did something counter-attitudinal, that you wrote this essay that went against? Okay, well, of course, all of you, if I had you write an essay 10 minutes ago about why raising tuition is good, you'd remember that, no problem. Okay? But amnesics don't. Okay, so amnesics are folks who have trouble forming new memories. So I've told you about them before, and you've heard about them in different contexts. So you can go in and you can, meet an amnesic, talk to them for a half an hour, have a pretty normal conversation with them, walk out of the room, come back in 5 minutes later, and they'll treat you as if they've never met you before. Okay? Because they can't lay down new memories explicitly, new explicit memories, where they can consciously say, I remembered what happened 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes ago, yesterday. So they have a major problem with explicit memory. So we ran a free choice study, the kind with the 8 appliances, although we didn't use appliances in ours. Okay. And I'm not going to go into the details of exactly how we did the study, but the critical thing is that we compared how amnesics and non-amnesic healthy controls showed attitude change in this kind of dissonance paradigm. So, not surprisingly, when you run the healthy controls, they show that the items that they selected go up in the re-rankings compared to the initial rankings, and the items that they rejected went down in the re-rankings compared to the initial rankings. Okay? And this is the standard attitude change effect you get in the free choice paradigm, right? It's just like the Brehm study. Okay? So what do our amnesic subjects do? Well, they actually show the exact same effect. Okay? So the amnesic subjects say now that they like the thing that they selected, they don't like the thing that they rejected, more so than in their initial rankings, except our amnesics cannot remember that they ever selected between these items and these items. And we tested that. So we showed them the 2 items. Okay, in our case, it was actually 4 items. It's a little complicated. That's not what's important here. But we showed them the items that they were selecting among after they made these re-rankings, and they were at chance for saying which one they had chosen. Okay? They couldn't tell us which one they had chosen previously. They couldn't even tell us which 2 items out of the whole set of items they had been asked to make a choice between. So they have no memory for having chosen item number 4 over item number 5, and yet they now show the same attitude change process. Okay? So this suggests that it is very unlikely that in all cases of dissonance, people are actually consciously remembering the thing they did that's counter-attitudinal. They're not consciously remembering the conflict. Something is happening that doesn't involve that kind of conscious memory. Okay? And I'm not going to go into all the details of what probably is happening. For those of you who are sort of on the cog-sci end of things, maybe majoring in cog-sci, what we think might be going on here is something that's referred to as a constraint satisfaction process. But I'm not going to go into details, and trust me, I won't ask you about constraint satisfaction on the final. If I do, you can hit my thumb with a hammer. Okay? Fair enough? I said that on tape. Go ahead. So this suggests that there's a major hole in the sort of standing theories of cognitive dissonance. We also wanted to test this another way. So this time we did a study where we used cognitive load versus no cognitive load. So this is where you're rehearsing an 8-digit number, although that's not how we did it in this study, but it's kind of the same idea. And so folks who aren't rehearsing the 8-digit number show a spread between the ones they rejected and the ones they selected versus the ones they rejected. Okay? And also the folks who are under cognitive load show a similar spread. Now, this one seems to be a little bit more about the selection side, and this one a little bit more about the rejection side. But when you replicate this, that goes away. The key thing is that the new difference between these two of 1.15 is pretty close to the difference here of 1.25. So these folks are under cognitive load the whole time, and the likelihood that they could be thinking about their physiological arousal and then thinking about, well, why am I feeling this way? I know I'm feeling this way because of the counter-attitudinal essay I wrote. I better spend some time changing my attitude. They're not going to be able to do this because they're busy rehearsing other information that prevents them from engaging in that kind of reflective conscious thinking about their attitudes. Okay? So that addresses this issue of thinking. And then Laura Egan and some other folks at Yale did some other studies, actually explicitly building on this study that we had done, where they looked at some other folks that probably could engage in a lot of conscious reflective thinking. They looked at little kids, 3-year-olds, and monkeys. Okay? And I'm not going to explain the whole study to you because it's a slightly different paradigm and it gets a little complicated. The thing to take away from this is that monkeys show the same dissonance effects adults do, and little 3-year-olds show the same dissonance effects that adults do. So these folks are probably not consciously, reflectively engaging in these rationalization processes. All of these studies together suggest that these things are happening relatively automatically, without awareness. And it makes sense that if your attitude is changing automatically, you wouldn't recognize it. And so when you're later asked, what was your old attitude? You'd say, well, it's the same as the attitude I have now, because I have no awareness that my attitude ever changed, because it changed automatically. Okay? Is this set of studies clear?
So from this one, can you say that like cognitive dissonance isn't something you learn? Like, almost innate?
So the question was, is this something you learn or is it innate? It's not about innate or learned. It's about sort of the way the mechanisms of the mind work when we're in a situation that produces kind of a conflict between two cognitions. The key distinction here is whether it's an automatic, perhaps stream of consciousness process, or whether it's a reflective conscious process that requires explicit thought and mental effort. And what I want to tell you is that these studies do not establish that dissonance is always automatic, but it establishes at least that it is sometimes automatic, and that's not something the original theories took into account. We haven't proved that every time someone ever rationalizes, it's an automatic process. I'm sure there are times when people rationalize and it's not an automatic process at all. But at least in a number of situations, it appears that it may be an automatic process, which changes the way we look at the people that we see rationalizing. If you see someone rationalizing, don't assume to yourself that they know that their position has changed. Okay? They may not. In the same way that we have subjective construals that allow us to see the world differently from one another without realizing that we're probably seeing the world differently, the same person sees the world differently at different points in time before and after the dissonance processes have kicked in, and the before person and the after person don't realize that they have different positions. Okay? So when you look at that person from the outside, don't assume that they're just choosing to tell lies now. I mean, maybe they are. If they're a politician, they probably are. Okay? But if they're not a politician, if they're just one of us, there's a chance that they may not actually know. So the last thing I want to say here is I want to make the connection back to objective self-awareness, because probably for some of you, you've been thinking, some of these things sound a lot like the kinds of things that were looked at in objective self-awareness, or maybe it was just sort of rattling somewhere in the back of your head without you really explicitly making the connection. But in both cases, you're dealing with kind of a conflict between sort of some behavior and your sort of attitudes, beliefs, and values. Now, in objective self-awareness, typically the behavior hasn't occurred yet. Well, sometimes at least, right? So sometimes you're debating whether to cheat, whether to take more candy, and objective self-awareness can prevent you from engaging in the bad behavior. Okay? Or, objective self-awareness says, if you've already engaged in the bad behavior and you're made objectively self-aware, you might leave the situation or just feel worse about yourself. Those are kind of the options that were discussed in the context of objective self-awareness. Cognitive dissonance theory, CDT, suggests that there's another way to essentially escape objective self-awareness. This extra way that we have to escape is that we can revise our beliefs, attitudes, and so on, so now our behavior in retrospect fits more with our attitudes and beliefs that we think we've always held, but we actually just got. Do I think that there's a module responsible for that? Mark Summers. If that is your fake name. That's right. So we've done some fMRI studies on this now. So, I mean, we have some data. I don't actually believe in modules in the sense that I think evolutionary psychologists sometimes think about them, or Jerry Fodor, who kind of came up with the idea in the 80s, thought about them. But I do think that there's specific mechanisms in the brain that are associated with this. And I can give you a copy of the paper that we've written on this. If you email, I can send you that. We have the paper under review right now. Okay. I've also told you about this already, so I'm going to skip over that. And now we're going to move on, okay, to our next lecture. We are done rationalizing. Okay. We're going to start with a couple of video clips. And hopefully, for one of them, be able to get some sound going. So, okay, so what I want you to do here, okay, so I'm going to show you this little video here, and I just want you to watch it and pay attention. Simple little video, just watch. It lasts, I think, about 40 seconds or so. Here we go. Okay, so somebody raise your hand and tell me what you saw. Very simple. Somebody, what'd you see? A triangle bullying another small triangle. And what about the circle? The circle hides. Okay, what else? In the back, yep. They seem to be in a relationship with each other. And where's the big triangle fit in? He's the other man. Right? So the two triangles are fighting over the circle. Okay. Anyone else?
In-group, out-group, and how alliances are formed, and then...
That's what you saw? Man, okay. Okay. So Dennis the Menace situation, the big triangle was the old guy who says, "Get off my lawn." I like that. Yeah, okay. Anything else? Did anyone see sort of parents and children? Yeah, okay. So you get sort of about 10% of people who say they see parents and children, although you get more of that if you show this to an audience of people who are parents who have children. How many people saw some kind of like sort of romantic triangle where there's sort of the two triangles were fighting over the circle? Okay, good chunk of people. So you usually get 50% or more of people who see it that way. Who was the meanest of the three The big triangle. And who was the most scared of the three? That's right. And what did the small triangle want? Freedom, to protect the circle. The circle wanted to protect the small triangle. All right. Okay, so the key thing to understand here is that you're all wrong, of course, because they're triangles and circles made out of felt. Okay? So nobody was chasing anybody. There was no romantic relationship. Okay, the people who made this video made sure that the felt all stayed in different boxes. They had never met each other before they were in this. Okay? Nobody wanted to do anything in this video. Nobody was a bully. Nobody was the tough one and nobody was the weak one because they're little pieces of felt. Okay, little pieces of felt don't have intentions, desires, experiences. Okay, this video was made in 1944 by Fritz Heider. He was the guy who came up with balance theory that we talked about 2 lectures ago. It's referred to as the fighting triangles. And the critical thing here is that when we look at this video, we can't help but see what's in this video in terms of human mental states, thoughts, beliefs, desires, personality. Right? We can't help but immediately see these events in human social terms. Okay? Anyone want to guess who doesn't see this that way? What group of people don't see this that way? Children see it this way. Who doesn't? Autistic kids. So kids with severe autism are the only people who, when you ask them to write down their description of what they saw, they say, there was a triangle that moved up, the triangle moved left, the circle did this. And it's all in non-psychological terms. Okay? Also, people who have what's damage to a region of the brain called the amygdala, if they have that damage essentially when they're an infant, not when they get it as an adult, but if they have it when they're a very young child, they also misdescribe this just in terms of physical movements. Okay? But for the rest of us, this is the example that since the beginning of the class, when I referred to the fact that we don't see snakes and decide they're dangerous, we see dangerous snakes. That's what you were all doing here. You were seeing a bully. You didn't say to yourself, there's a triangle, and if I had to describe it in psychological terms, I would apply the label bully to that. Right? That's not what you did. You saw a bully. Everyone sees a bully, or they see some other narrative that has some coherent piece to it. Okay? I want to show you one other brief video, and then we'll end. This didn't used to be in my lectures, but it's a commercial that I saw. Got to get the sound up here. All right, I'm going to have to do this manually, but it's worth waiting to see this. Okay. This is IKEA. Wait a second. Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm going out of full screen. This isn't working. Okay. Are you getting the sound? Okay.
Many of you feel bad for this lamp. That is because you're crazy. It has no feelings, and the new one is much better.
Okay. We'll discuss next time.